I'm delighted in Yorkshire alone, I've now been involved with 2 businesses in the last 10 years, which have been the top 10 fastest growing in Yorkshire and the top 100 fastest growing in the UK. Business thrives in the UK. But as Amjad said, I'm here to speak about business for Britain. It's an impression you get if you read the newspapers, if you listen to the TV, you listen to the radio, that all the businesses in the UK want to stay in the EU. That is not the case. There's a significant proportion, particularly the small and medium-sized businesses, who can see untold advantages in leaving the EU. And I'll talk about some of those in a second. Because one of the things I just wanted to talk about is why I thought about the EU, decided to leave the EU or to vote to leave the EU. And business will come into that, but actually the thing that persuaded me is I looked around, I have an incredible valuable possession. It's not my house, it's not the shares I have, it's not the money I have in the bank. The valuable possession that I have is the power that I lend to politicians every 4 years to pass laws over me and to pass laws over the businesses I'm involved with. That is a valuable, valuable possession. And every 4 or 5 years we expect our politicians to come back to us and to say, we've done a good job, you trusted it and we delivered and we want you to vote for us again. And when we give that power away, because governments don't have powers except what we give to them, it seems to me that the best way in which that power is exercised, if it's exercised close to us, if it's accountable to us and it's representative of us. And in the UK, we seem to have accepted that as a general principle. We have devolution to a greater or lesser extent in Scotland, Northern Ireland, in Wales. If you look at Manchester, we're talking about devolution of spending powers in the healthcare economy. And when people talk about the Northern Powerhouse, we're talking about ways in which we can devolve powers to local politicians. Because that makes sense. You want to be able to see the people who are spending your money and passing the laws that affect what you do. So to me, it just absolutely beggars belief that we have allowed a system to develop where we as a country have allowed our politicians to give away something like 70% of our lawmaking powers to a group of institutions in another country. Now, I don't remember ever being asked if that power that I lent to those politicians could be given away. I don't know if you ever remember being asked if you could have those powers given away. And I talk about that group of institutions in a foreign country. To me, those institutions are undemocratic, they're unrepresentative, they're not accountable to us. You know, if you look at the 3 main institutions that make up the EU that govern how we do our daily business, the EU Parliament. As a country, we represent about 13% of the EU's population. We have fewer than 10% of the MEPs in that parliament. We have 1 MEP for every 900,000 people in this country. Luxembourg and Malta have an MEP for every 90,000 people. That doesn't seem to be very representative. Across the EU as a whole, on average, they will have twice as many MEPs per head of population as we do. It's not representative of us in the UK. And that manifests itself when you look at what happens when UK MEPs get together to oppose a law which is against UK interests. I think it's happened close to about 600 times now. 80% of the time that happens, the law gets passed anyway. Our interests are being overridden by people from other countries. You then look at that parliament, it has no teeth really, it has no power to initiate legislation. That rests in the hands of the Commission. A Commission which is unelected, is full of people who are failed or unsuccessful politicians. I'll mention some names, the likes of Mandelson, Kinnock, the famous Baroness Ashton who dictated our foreign policy in the EU. A veritable house of the dead, one might say. Yet a commission that has power to initiate legislation. And disturbingly, one where, going back 25 years or so, we had 15% of the votes. We now have about 4%. We then look at the Council of Europe. We used to have 17% of the representation in that. We have now about 8%. And with qualified majority voting in a vast number of arenas, our ability as a country to influence measures that are against our interests is eroded every single day. In that council, we have opposed measures on about 70 occasions that were against our interests. 40 of those since Cameron became Prime Minister, I'll add. Not once have we been successful in blocking those measures. This is a group of institutions which are corporatist, they are oligarchic, they love a few people running our destiny. And I'll come back to that in a second in terms of the impact that has on the small businesses in this country, because that system is prone to lobbying. When you centralise power in the way it's been done in the EU, lobbyists have tremendous influence. People who try to sway what decisions are being taken that affect us. It's estimated that there are about 30,000 lobbyists operating in Brussels at the moment, trying to influence the laws that affect you. So, although I'm talking from a business point of view, I've given away my most valuable possession, and I didn't even know I'd done it. So, what's it costing us, and what benefits are we getting if I put a business hat on? Is what we get out of the EU worth what we've given away? Amjad's already mentioned, I'm sure it'll come up time and time again, £350 million a week. Well, let's put that in a slightly more local context, Yorkshire and the Humberside. It's estimated that we give about £1.1 billion per annum to the EU from this area alone. Now, sounds like it's difficult to get your head around that figure in a way, but let's try and put some context on it. It's close to 25 times what we spent in this area on flood defences. And we saw the impact over the last winter of what floods can do in cities like Leeds and Shipley and in the Calder Valley. Even more relevantly, Amjad talked about his experience in hospitals and doctors. That's enough to build 4 district hospitals a year. And as he said, I'm a director of the Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust. Money is not flowing, I can say that. We've got that as a direct cost. Those of you who are in business will know that every part of your business is covered by a regulation that comes through from the EU. It's estimated that those regulations, just the top 100 that affect businesses in this country, cost us about £33 billion a year. A massive sum of money. But the reason I think it's particularly relevant is because of this. This country is a nation of small businesses. Most jobs in this country are created by the small, medium-sized businesses. There's only about 7,000 businesses in the UK that have more than 250 employees. Job growth, job creation comes from those smaller, growing businesses. And the reason why that regulation side of things is important, because only 5% of businesses in this country actually export to the EU. But 100% of them have to comply with those regulations. Why is that important? Well, I'll give you an example of a business I know in Yorkshire. I won't give any names or too much detail. But it's a business which is a very young company, a few years old, and has developed a product which is being sold in the UK after a period of trials, going through regulatory tests. It's a chemical style product. It is now being sold across the UK. But in the EU, they're now working on drafting a new regulation, a new directive. That directive will require that company to go through all of that testing, all of that certification again. It will cost them about £100,000. Now, if you're a GlaxoSmithKline, that doesn't matter. £100,000 is a drop in the ocean. For a business in Yorkshire that's just started, that can be the difference between growing and creating jobs or being one of the victims of the EU and failing. And that's why I think the regulation side of this is important. The interesting thing then is, what do we get back out of it? Because people talk about the benefits of being in the EU. Back in 2011, Ed Davey, who was then a minister of the Department of Business, said that the real benefit is that business inside the EU, countries trade with each other twice as much as they would do in the absence of the single market. And that sounds fantastic. The trouble is, there isn't a shred of evidence for that. Because even the House of Commons Library says there's been no real definitive study of the economic impact of the UK's membership of the EU. There's been a range of limited studies, some depending on which side they come from will show a small cost, some will show a small benefit. But you know, back in the beginning part of this year, Civitas, a think tank, did a study of the benefits of the EU membership on our trade. And they looked at it in two aspects. Firstly, we hear about the trade agreements that the EU has entered into on our behalf and how we benefit from that. Well, 42 years of allowing the EU to negotiate on our behalf has resulted in agreements with about 55 countries whose combined GDP in 2014 was about $7.7 trillion. Sounds like a lot. But let me look at a few other countries that are smaller than us, standalone independent countries. Korea entered into trade agreements with countries whose gross domestic product was 41 trillion. Chile, 58 trillion. Singapore, 39 trillion. Switzerland, 40 trillion. Small countries outside of a trading bloc like the EU who've been significantly more successful in opening up trade agreements than the EU has. Do you know what the worst thing is? With 2/3 of the countries with whom we've entered into those trade agreements through the EU, UK exports have actually dropped afterwards. So then the question is, well, have we seen the trade with the EU increase that we're told has happened? Well, actually, yes, is the answer. We have. But if you compare the growth rates since we entered the single market of our exports to the EU with those before, we're actually trading at about a quarter, 22-23% lower than we should have been had those growth rates continued. We haven't been successful in penetrating it. But what's even more galling is that countries outside of the EU, who don't even have the benefit of trade agreements with the EU, have been spectacularly more successful. If you look at the period from 1973 through 2012 in real terms, we grew our exports to the EU by about, 11 founding members of the single market, by about 72%. India grew theirs by 276%. The US and Canada by about 115%. And Australia by about 190%. Our record of exporting to the EU looks disastrous in comparison. Those benefits that are talked about, in my opinion, have not materialised. And Amjad's already referred to it. Our share of exports to the EU as a whole is dropping. It used to be around 55%, it's now down below 45%. And if you look at current trends, it's going to drop even further. And some estimates would show down to about 35% over the next few years. But from a British point of view, what's disturbing is this aspect of the single market is a misnomer as well. You can argue there's a single trade in goods, but I would strongly argue that where the UK is very, very strong in its service sector, its creative industries, the digital technologies that are developing rapidly, where we are very strong, there is no real functioning single market in Europe, in the EU, with the exception of some areas of retail banking. It's a system which was designed to cater to protect German manufacturing and French agriculture, totally irrelevant to the needs of the UK economy as it's developed. And it's a market that is declining itself. Amjad's already said, as a share of global domestic product, it has fallen and it's going to continue to fall. It's probably the most spectacularly unsuccessful trading bloc in the world. And none of the others require anybody to have a single currency or freedom of movement. So, from a business point of view, it costs us a lot of money, and the benefits do not appear to be there. But in terms of the future, the third reason why I think we should leave the EU is a mixture of the sheer optimism that's been expressed here today. There's an entire world out there to trade with. The EU has failed to deliver that market to us, but I think we've been very successful in developing it ourselves. John Longworth, who you may remember is the head of the British Chamber of Commerce, who resigned recently because he came out in favour of leaving the EU, is the head of our Business Council in Business for Britain. And John will tell you that he's had meetings with ambassadors from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, who all confirm that trade agreements with them would be done as quickly as possible once we leave the EU. Because they realise that we are a vibrant, growing economy and they want to do business with us. the ties with the Commonwealth that have been spoken about, a tremendous shared culture, shared language, shared legal system, shared business structure, all of which make trade much easier. And I understand that people don't like change. I know that. People think that voting to remain in the EU is a vote for things staying the same. I tell you that's not the case, as far as I'm concerned. Because at the moment Britain is one of two countries that is either not or not obliged to be a member of the euro. In the next few years, there are crises looming. We've already seen the Greek crisis and the effect it's had on the EU. In my view, Greece is not far from further default. But beyond that, I think France and Italy, if their growth rates continue as they are, will face serious debt problems in the near future. So who's going to bail that out? Germany? Yeah, possibly. But who's the only other economy that could come anywhere near helping to bail that out? That's us. And whatever Osborne says about our shelter from bailing out the EU, we've seen that we've had to contribute indirectly through European Stabilisation Funds to bail out the euro. That, I'm convinced, will happen again. So I balance a thriving potential gold mine in the future against being tied into a declining, bureaucratic, sick trading bloc. I've come to the decision there's no real option but to vote for that optimistic future and vote to leave the EU.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
hope that you'll do the same.
What a thoughtful and insightful delivery. Have any of you heard of Cecilia Malmström? 2 or 3 people. Has anybody heard of Violetta Bulk? Nobody. Has anybody heard of Niven Mimica? Nobody. These are 3 people that I named out of the 28 commissioners that have been appointed. Nobody's heard of them. They're unelected bureaucrats, as Carl has said, and we can't remove them. If I do a lousy job in the next few years, you have a right to kick me out. If Andrea messes up, you have a right to call it a day with it. But you can't with these people. These are people are selected by a few to rule over us. Complete lack of democracy. The democracy I like is what we have in Westminster, which each one of you can elect or deselect the person standing. Carl also mentioned businesses. Now, I'm on the trade committee in the EU, and I stand up for small and medium businesses. For 3rd time running, the European Commission has tried to foist down our throats legislation to do with the ports. We have a very, very successful system of privatised ports. They don't need any further legislation. They've tried 3 times, they haven't been able to do it. Now they've gone and said, oh, we need a trialogue where the European Council, the European Parliament and the Commission will decide. It's a way of getting through what they can't do with elected people like myself. It's undemocratic. These are the things that Carl has mentioned, and rightly so. Now, I come to a friend of mine, a very good friend, who's been a guiding hand to me once I entered the European Parliament. Dan Hannan is a writer, a journalist, and has been a Conservative MEP for the South East of England since 1999. In 2009, Dan won Speech of the Year at the Spectator Awards for his speech to the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown in the European Parliament. And has been named on numerous occasions by the Telegraph as one of the most 100 influential people in the centre-right in the United Kingdom, peaking as the 10th most influential in 2009. Dan's also wrote a host of books, including How We Invented Freedom and Why It Matters. Also, The Plan, 12 Months to Renew Britain. And most recently, had a book published but last month entitled Why Vote Leave. Those books are available for you here, by the way. Born in Peru, Dan speaks fluent Spanish and French and loves Europe, but believes the EU is making its constituent nations poorer, less democratic and less free. Welcome, Dan Hammond.